Hello, this is Bill Croft from the University of New Mexico, and I first would like to thank the organizers of the SIGTYP workshop for inviting me to come and present this talk to you. My talk is called Crosslingual Syntactic and Semantic Annotation, Typological and Ethical Precepts. So, as I said, the main issue I'll be focusing on is crosslingual annotation. So one very specific application for natural language processing across languages. And there's a number of issues that arise in cross-linguistic annotation for both syntax and semantics that don't normally arise with monolingual annotation schemes. Languages diverge widely in the meanings that they conventionally express and in the formal means they use to do so. So my main thesis here is that annotation schemes need to be flexible to accommodate variation, but maintain cross-linguistic comparability or consistency. And it's a rather different situation in both syntax and semantics. I will be illustrating this point fairly generally because of the time limitations with the Universal Dependencies project for syntactic annotation and the Uniform Meaning Representation project for semantic annotation, a project that I've been directly involved with for the last 2 years. And then I'm going to close with some discussion of a very important issue, which is how will these annotation schemes drawing on data from many different languages around the world actually contribute to the use of these applications, natural language processing in these communities. So if we look at universal dependencies from a typological perspective, it's useful to introduce some basic concepts in typology that will be relevant for understanding the value of universal dependencies and potential for cross-linguistic annotation. So the main issue is that the grammatical concepts used in linguistic description are language-specific because they are defined by language-specific properties, a point that I've made for many years and also a prominent typologist, Martin Hasselmann, has made more recently. He coined the term comparative concepts for the kinds of theoretical concepts that we need in order to actually describe cross-linguistic categories, grammatical categories. I define 2 particular types of comparative concepts. This actually has a long history in typology. It's not something new that I've invented. The first are constructions, which is whatever structure is used to express a function, such as an adjective, a predicate adjective, no matter how it's expressed in different languages. It's the same construction. Then we have strategies. So that's a specific but still cross-linguistically definable structure that's used to express one of those functions, like a predicate adjective. So we can illustrate this here with actually predicate nominals. This is an example from one of the UD papers. We have 2 different ways to express the predication of a category. So the category is being the best dancer. Ivan is the best dancer in English. In Russian, it's Ivan Luchi Tansor. So they both express the same construction, predication of an object concept. However, the strategies are different. In English, you have a copula, the form be, inflected, so it's the form is in the sentence. In Russian, you have no copula, and you also have no inflection on the noun. So they're quite different strategies. However, the point that's important here is what 2 languages, and more generally languages with the predication of object concept constructions have in common is they use the same content words. So Ivan, best, and dancer. And universal dependencies have taken advantage of this fact, this universal fact for the most part, and says that they aim to push all the way the design principle of having direct links between content words. This is a good thing because function words, such as a copula in English, are strategies and they're not found in every language. So we saw that they're not found in Russian, for example, at least in the present tense. So what this means is that the topology of the dependency trees, the syntactic dependency trees, and universal dependencies are basically fine from a typological universal point of view. That, of course, was one of the goals of UD. So that's good news. The other good news that I'll have to take a few slides to explain is that syntax is actually not as difficult as you might think for cross-linguistic comparison. And the reason for this has to do with the role that syntax plays in expressing these functions, these meanings of language. We can see this with something that I've worked on for pretty much my entire career with parts of speech, things like nouns, verbs, and adjectives. These have posed extremely vexing problems for cross-linguistic analysis. Definitions of parts of speech are language-specific. They involve morphological inflections, specialized syntactic constructions like that copula construction that we just looked at. So when you hear a claim like saying some language has no adjectives or even no noun-verb distinction, these are basically due to definitions of categories like adjectives based on European part of speech strategies in their grammars. But strategies vary across languages. So what's the solution to this? We need to look at parts of speech as a combination of semantic content, so that's like object concepts, property concepts for adjectives, action concepts for verbs, and information packaging, something that I've argued for a long time. And I'll illustrate this in the next slide with a table that I have been using for all these years. So the kinds of information packaging that we're thinking of here is reference, referring to some concept, modification, using the concept to modify some other concept, a referring concept in particular, and predication of the concept. So you can see from this table that you can refer to objects, properties, and actions. You can predicate objects, properties, and actions, but you use different constructions in those different cells in the table. So the main point is that you can package the same concepts in different ways. So we have to disassociate concepts like object, property, and action from how they are used in the language. And this has important functions, particularly in the analysis of discourse, though I won't be going into that in this talk. The main point here is just to say that when we look at cross-linguistic comparison based on the function of a sentence, in order to try to get a handle on not getting caught up with all the variation in grammatical form, that we need to think of function as having two dimensions like this. So this split-level analysis of function accounts for typological variation in form and allows us to distinguish part-of-speech constructions like object predication, property predication, from part-of-speech strategies like copula or inflection. And in fact, since that early work of mine, I've argued that all linguistic meaning, that is, meanings of grammatical constructions of all types, can be described as the information packaging of semantic content. This is not a particularly new idea. The slide refers to work by the pragmatics psycholinguist Herb Clark's concept of formulation. So in theories of generation, natural language generation, this is an idea that has been kicking around for a while. What does this mean for UD? Well, information packaging functions are much more isomorphic to syntactic structures than semantic classes or participant roles. Information packaging functions are less variable across languages, i.e. they're more universal than lexical semantics. Well, more obviously universal. Actually, there isn't that much work on the lexical semantic typology, so we really don't know. And lexical semantics might, I hope, have more universal patterns that we currently tend to think. And so this is all because information packaging is the function of structural, so-called structural morphosyntactic properties. So for this reason, syntax is actually not that hard cross-linguistically, despite all the variation in what we typologists call morphosyntactic strategies for expressing these information packaging functions. It's not that difficult to get around them. So typology can help in selecting and defining the categories of a syntactic annotation scheme like universal dependencies. I could give a whole talk about that, but what I've just described gives you a hint of how to do that. But UD is a very coarse-grained syntax, and languages have a great number of much more specific, specialized constructions that would have to be squeezed into UD trees. So guidelines need to be developed in order to deal with a great variety of constructions found across languages. The task is not over once you have come up with a annotation scheme like UD, even though in my opinion, version 2 is really quite good. So I'm going to use one case study here just to show how typology can contribute to these guidelines. So consider the categories of subordinate clauses and event nominals. They both represent arguments that are events, so events being referred to in the context of a predicate argument structure. But these two types of grammatical categories, subordinate clauses and event nominals, are distinguished in UD. And in fact, there's several different subtypes, so we don't need to worry about that for now. Now, constructions with events as arguments use a wide range of morphosyntactic strategies, even just in English. So in the sentence, I'm surprised that he fired Flynn, the subordinate clause looks just like a main clause. He fired Flynn. I'm surprised by his firing of Flynn. Now it looks like a noun phrase with the his possessive modifier and the of phrase following it. And then the last one, his firing Flynn, you got a noun phrase looking possessive, his, but then you have Flynn expressed as a direct object like a verb. So this has all been very confusing, both in theoretical syntax as well as typology and in any kind of practical scheme. Makes you wonder if you can distinguish subordinate clauses or event nominals. So if you look at the strategies for event arguments, you got this internal syntax, inflection of that word, the verb word, the action word like firing, with tense aspect of modality, like the English past tense in purple in the first sentence. Person indexation of arguments of the event word. We don't see that really here because English doesn't have this kind of subject agreement even in the past tense. And case marking of the arguments in the event word. That's done by the prepositions by the he versus his form, the of form within the subordinate clause. By actually is part of the other pot, what we call the external syntax, whether or not the verbal form allows reasonably productive case marking. That is, that the verb form either inflects for case, takes a preposition or a postposition like English by. So the thing to notice here is, okay, there's a lot of variation, and I can tell you there's a lot of variation across languages, but if you notice just looking at the examples, that in the first example, you have this past tense marker, and you don't have any kind of preposition. And in the second and third examples, you have the preposition, but no verbal inflection. Well, it turns out this fact of English is a universal fact. There is this dissociation of the two strategies. If the event word can take case affixes or adpositions, then it does, with overwhelming frequency, it does not inflect for tense aspect modality like the main clause verb. If, however, the event word takes case affixes or appositions, then it also does not express person indexation, agreement, like a main clause verb. So in other words, these two strategies are almost entirely mutually exclusive. If you look at the raw data from Cristoforo's book, you'll see that there's a few exceptions. There are 7 under case marking and tense aspect modality, and 8 under case marking and person indexation. But these are really exceptions in the pattern. From the practical point of view of cross-lingual syntactic annotation, they're going to be very rare. We don't want to change our annotation scheme for a very small set of languages. So external case marking event words coincides with the non-clause-like tense aspect mood inflection or person indexation. The one thing that doesn't fit in here is how the case marking of the arguments of the event word do. And that's highly variable. You saw that in English, where you could even mix and match a possessive pronoun like his with object marking of Flynn and his firing Flynn. So you can use the case marking of the event word as a guideline to distinguish subordinate clauses from nominalizations in almost every language that you will be annotating. And however, case marking of arguments of the event word, they're so variable across languages that we can't really distinguish how they're expressed. So they should be annotated consistently, probably like the participant roles in main clauses. Now I'd like to turn to semantic annotation. And here we're looking at semantic categories. These are mainly categories that are expressed by grammatical inflections, sometimes with function words. And what we want to know cross-linguistically is semantics is a lot harder than syntax. It's not so obvious what the universal bases of categories are. So what are the basic categories that are worth capturing in semantic annotation? And how do we accommodate languages that do not express these basic semantic categories grammatically? So you might see a list of semantic categories for a particular semantic domain, like modality, the example I will use. And you'll find that there are languages that have more coarse-grained categories in their grammar to distinguish different modalities, languages with more fine-grained categories, and languages with cross-cutting categories. So how do we deal with this variation? Our solution is to basically allow annotators to be flexible in the semantic distinctions that they annotate in their own language while preserving consistency across languages. Having said that, we do encourage annotators to make the basic level semantic distinctions that we identify whenever possible. So we'll start by looking at basic level semantic distinctions. How do we figure out what those basic level semantic distinctions are? So the first criterion is frequency of cross-linguistic occurrence. We are taking as our heuristic that if the distinction is made in around half of the world's languages or more, we consider the distinction basic. For many of the categories, such as modality, there is already existing typological research that can answer a question like that one. The second criterion is ease of annotation, even in a language that doesn't make the distinction grammatically. So for example, I'm not going to discuss in more detail in tense, as all of you may know, English has a perfect tense, like I have eaten. And quite a lot of languages have a perfect tense. I wouldn't say it's 50%, but it's pretty close. However, this is a very challenging distinction to make if you don't have that distinction in your language, and it's even pretty challenging for semanticists to analyze. So we didn't include that in our annotation categories for tense because of that. So let's go to modality here. I mentioned modality, and I'm thinking in terms of modal strength. So neutral modality is what we think of as possible, something is possible, expressed in English by the auxiliary might. Partial strength is something that's probable, expressed by the modal must, like you must be kidding. And full modal strength is that it's a necessary or certain. It's something that's explicitly asserted without any kind of modal hedging. Now, finer grained distinctions are made in some languages. So for instance, partial, this probable, can be either a weak partial or a strong partial at modal strength. Now, we do have a survey, a typological survey of epistemic modality by Casper Boy over a 50-language sample. And he writes that the distinction between full, partial, and neutral support is cross-linguistically significant in the sense that cross-linguistically, linguistic expressions are often found which can be described as covering one of these degrees of epistemic support, but not any of the others. So in other words, if you don't make any finer grained distinctions like weak partial versus strong partial, you'll be able to accommodate the grammatical or the modal semantics distinctions that are made in the great majority of the languages of the world, extrapolating from this 50-language sample. But of course, there are languages that don't fit. So how do we deal with the languages that don't fit? We basically propose a lattice structure of annotation categories. The lattices are based on typological insights, such as what Casper Boy found in his survey of modal systems in the world's languages. They are related to the semantic map model in typology, at least for a small set of distinctions like the ones you find in the category of modality. They're a little bit easier to visualize and manipulate. So here's our annotation lattice for modality, or modal strength to be more precise. So in the middle, you see those three categories: full, partial, and neutral. Then you have to the right more fine-grained categories: strong and weak partial. Also, there's a strong and weak neutral that Boy identifies. And then to the left, you have higher order categories: a non-neutral that subsumes both full and partial, and then a non-full that subsumes neutral and partial. And that's because there are languages that have a full, non-full modal strength grammatical system, and languages that have a neutral, non-neutral modal strength grammatical system. And we want to be able to handle both of those. So let's start by looking at the languages we want to consider. So a language like English that has full, partial, and neutral, we just use that middle row, so to speak, in the lattice. Those will represent the basic categories that should be doable, even if the grammar lacks the distinctions. We think the semantic instructions could be precise enough to allow people to make those distinctions, even if the grammar lacks it. If there are finer grained categories, we encourage annotators to use the finer grained categories. This is for a language Limbu, a Tibeto-Burman language spoken in the Himalayas. They make a distinction between strong partial and weak partial, as well as full and neutral. And if you can make that distinction, you should. The lattice will allow us to compare Limbu with a language like English, which has only a single kind of partial category. If you have coarser grained categories, we still encourage them to make the distinction. So for instance, in Southern Nambikwara, South American, Native American language, it has a full, non-full modal strength system. If an annotator can follow our semantic instructions, and we're optimistic they should be able to do so, they should be able to make the distinction between partial and neutral modal strength, even though the language does not do so grammatically. If, however, for whatever reason, either there's a particular context which is difficult to judge and the grammar doesn't help you, or it's just not clear to the annotator, then we allow them to use the non-full category. Again, this can be compared to other language systems such as English, where partial and neutral distinctions are made. So the tricky case is when you have cross-cutting categories, a language that has a grammatical modality system that doesn't even fit our categories that we have selected here. So one example of this is a Mayan Indian language, Hakaltek, and they have a system which is called weak support versus strong support. If you look at the lattice here, weak support would include both those neutral categories and weak partial, and strong support would include full, but also strong partial. So it cuts across our lattice. We don't want to overcomplicate the lattice by creating this. It's a rare system, so we are following the general principle of not excessively complicating our annotation scheme with for distinctions that are made by a very small number of languages. But we still want to be able to allow a Hakaltek field worker or a Hakaltek, native Hakaltek person to annotate their language semantically, even though the scheme doesn't quite fit what their language does grammatically. So one possibility is if the annotators have enough semantic training that they can actually make the distinction between full and strong partial, even though they're both expressed by the Hakaltek strong support form, and likewise between neutral and weak partial, then we basically let them do it. So they're making stronger distinctions than you find in their language, but you aren't really making them try to take the partial category and split out the strong and weak partials, even though their language doesn't really express that distinction. But what if this annotator isn't sure, or the annotator's semantic training is not as strong as you might want? And this is going to be an issue that I will be taking up in the last part of this talk. Well, we have considered several different options, but concluded that the best option is that if you have a case where it's unclear whether it's to the annotator, whether it's weak, partial, or neutral, or strong, partial, and full, then the best thing to do is to annotate the category that's higher up on the lattice. So the category label is correct. It's a little broad for what is actually being encoded in the language, but it is a way to assimilate a language like Hochultek without making any of its annotations actually incompatible with the semantics, the actual semantics of the sentence. This seemed to us to be the best way to handle a situation where annotators are not fully certain of the semantic distinctions because they aren't grammatically expressed in the language. There's no grammatical clues, but we still want them to be able to annotate their language with a system, a lattice that is not too complicated, and then we don't end up actually altering the system so that the lattice gets more complicated just for a tiny handful of languages. Now I'd like to turn to that last topic, which is the ethical side of computational linguistic research on the languages of the world, in particular on indigenous languages, which is where many of the field linguists whose work, whose language documentation description is an essential prerequisite for any good cross-linguistic research, typological, computational, or whatever. These are the societies that those people, the field linguists, work with. And I have to say, I'm not a field linguist myself, so a lot of what I'm saying here is drawing on conversations with field linguists, particularly the ones that we are collaborating with us in our semantic annotation project. So the slide has the opening sentences of the proposal for the next year's SIGTYP conference, which addresses this issue. Luckily, happily, in the very opening sentences. A long-standing research direction in NLP targets the development of robust language technology applicable across the wide variety of the world's languages. This is not only an admirable research goal, but also our responsibility towards more inclusive and fairer NLP applications. Until this goal is met, there will be limited global access to important applications such as machine translation or information retrieval, potentially leading to a huge societal problem reflected in the digital language divide. So this is a very important and valuable and welcome goal. The last part of my talk will talk about this goal with respect to indigenous languages. It's going to be a bit of a warning of basically saying just how challenging this is going to be to achieve this goal. So we want to go beyond the kind of high resource languages that we all speak and we are using for most of our research, those of us who aren't doing specifically extending computational linguistic tools to other languages. In the computational linguistics world, there is the category of low resource languages. And as I understand that, these are languages that generally have online text. It's been generated by the speech community, so it's out there. You can scrape it off the web, but we don't have any curation or annotation, such as the annotation that we just talked about, and no web tools for that purpose. So these are the kind of languages which we think about when we think about trying to extend the annotation schemes in the way that I described in the first two parts of this talk. But I'd like to introduce another category, which I'm calling no resource languages. Of the over 7,000 languages of the world, it is estimated that 78% of them have no digital presence at all, or quite a minimal presence. Then there is no functional literacy in 75 to 80% of the languages. So actually rather similar set of a proportion of languages. By functional literacy, we mean literacy where the members of the speech community have a writing system and they actively use it to write the language. There are many languages where field linguists have done language documentation and description, and they've developed an orthography or at least a transcription system for a basically spoken language, but it's not necessarily being used by speakers of the language. Then there are languages where there's no significant language documentation at all. This is a number, about half of the world's languages that I've heard from talking to field linguists. It's not something I've seen documented, but there's a lot of languages out there that don't have any documentation at all. Now, that's actually another, I'm describing two extremes on a vast continuum. So there are languages that have a huge range of digital presences or degrees of literacy or degrees of documentation and description that by linguists that can be used for computational purposes. So I want to emphasize that there's a huge range here, even if there's a lot of languages that are at this bottom end. Now, why is this the case? In part, it's because you can see from this graph from the ethnologue that only about 8% of those 7,000 plus languages have institutional support. They're used by government, schools, mass media. Over 90% of the languages don't have that kind of institutional support. So they're just being spoken and used by the community without that. That's why so many of them don't have a digital presence. They don't have a orthography. They're not used in writing because they're just basically used for everyday interaction, which is mostly conversational. The other important point that we'll come back to is the size of these speech communities. These 8,000 languages aren't distributed evenly demographically. 94% of the languages of the world have less than 1 million speakers. That's less than a medium-sized city, like quite less than my own city, hometown here of Albuquerque in New Mexico. 80% of the world's languages have less than 100,000 speakers, less than the population of a town. And 20%, which is still about 1,500 languages, have less than 1,000 speakers. They're very small communities. So what's the connection between this and indigenous peoples? So there's about 500 million indigenous people in the world, where you have a population of around 6 or 7 billion. They belong to about 5,000 different groups in many different countries, speaking 4,000 languages. The map here basically is used to visualize the language density of different countries of the world, and you can see how that distorted map shows you where there are parts of the world with a high density of languages. So for more inclusive, fair NLP applications, there's actually a very bottom baseline, which you have to essentially build in order to be able to use the NLP applications that we talked about, such as the annotation schemes that we talked about at the beginning. First, they have to have institutional support for these languages. It's media, education, government. That presupposes literacy. And literacy, of course, is required for digital access. It's, at least for now, digital access is primarily through written text. So some of the kind of research that's being done by you in the audience having to do with things like automatic transcription of spoken language, and then using that for voice-activated applications. This is actually more essential and more important for creating more inclusive, fair NLP applications, just getting communities to the point where they can make use of NLP applications. And that's actually really important. Now, there's another issue about resources here in looking at extending computational linguistics and NLP tools to indigenous communities or a lot of minority communities in various countries. So high resource languages have long traditions of linguistic analysis and documentation. Many native speakers are experts in linguistics and computational linguistics. They've gotten the training. And then there's many people working on these high resource languages. So you have different teams who are working on syntactic annotation or processing, other teams working on semantic annotation and processing, not to mention other kinds of NLP applications in these languages. Now, when you go to Indigenous languages, it's typically done by a field linguist. And there's so many languages out there, it's often just one field linguist. Yes, there are languages where there are multiple field linguists working, but for many of those languages, it's just one person that becomes the linguistic expert on that language. They're usually not a native speaker, and they work closely with native speaker consultants. The work that these field linguists have to do is they have to gather data, spoken language data, so they have to time align any video and audio that they collect, transcribe it, create the interlinear glosses that allow us to linguistically analyze the language, and create a grammar and a dictionary. And there's software that most field linguists use, like Elan, Toolbox, and Flex, that were developed for this field work. Now, in the past, this has been somewhat controversially, linguists coming in and doing the field work and then leaving the community. But in the past 30 years or so, field linguists have increasingly collaborated with Indigenous communities, aiding them in language literacy, education, maintenance, and revitalization, and training community members as linguists. But many Indigenous communities are politically and economically marginalized, with little literacy or formal education in their native language and limited access to technology. And of course, these communities, as I said, are often very small. So just proportionately, the number of members of these communities that can develop gain the formal education that would give them the kind of linguistic and computational expertise necessary for developing this digital access is going to be small. So the lack of resources and expertise means that the burden of language documentation and description falls largely on the field linguist for many Indigenous languages. And so that linguist then has to be convinced of the value of doing, for example, just to think of the work that I've done, syntactic annotation and semantic annotation of the text they've collected word by word, using a different set of software tools from the ones that they're currently using, because, of course, the tools that I mentioned earlier weren't designed for these more advanced NLP applications. So in order to create more inclusive, fair NLP applications, obviously we have to develop orthography, we have to develop digital access, we have to have a community motivation for developing all of that through the use of their native language in government, education, and media. But then we have to develop these NLP annotation tools that are easy to use for a field linguist because they're doing it, using them on top of all the other work they do. And ideally, if perhaps a bit optimistically, for native speakers. So the first is to make sure your annotation scheme is simple. You don't want to make it too complicated. Lattices are going to be challenging enough. Another thing we've proposed that I haven't talked about in this talk is a roadmap for progressive stages of annotation, so that at stage 0, when a field linguist is initially documenting a language, that they don't have to immediately try to do a full-blown scheme like the ones that we would expect for English and Mandarin Chinese, but that they could progress towards that in a way that does not invalidate the work they did at early stages of the language, but can be incorporated into what they do at later stages of analysis and development. So minimal computational expertise or even linguistic expertise presupposed, so a lot of attention towards user interfaces that can be can be understood and acquired easily by people without a lot of expertise. A single integrated software tool, so developing tools for syntactic annotation. Essentially, we need a tool that doesn't just interface with the kinds of fieldwork tools, but actually can replace those. A lot of reasons behind that. And finally, a tool that runs on mobile devices as well as computers. That's because when you look at the digital access in the emerging world, lots and lots of people have cell phones, maybe not too sophisticated ones, but hardly anybody has a computer. So I'd like to thank all of my collaborators And thank you very much for listening to this talk.